Hi BookTube, it's Amy. It's Friday and I'm starting a long weekend that I've planned for myself using some vacation time. Took off work at noon today and I'm not going back to work until Tuesday, and so hopefully it's going to be a nice relaxing weekend with some reading, some walking, seeing a movie, hanging out with friends for Valentine's Day, that sort of thing. But I thought I would get things started with a video. I got some beer here, and this is a beer I've never tried before. There is a restaurant not far from me titled Three Brewers. And so I ordered some beer from them. I've got their white beer, their white brew, a few of those cans in the fridge, but I also got one of these, and I'm pretty sure this is a sour. So I'm gonna open it up and we'll see how this tastes. Yeah, this is from their location on Spark Street here, and I didn't know whether it was going to get through to me very easily. I ordered it through a food delivery app with my lunch, and I sort of took a chance because the restaurant is very close to the occupied protest zone downtown, but my driver seemed to have gotten through with no problem and brought me the pretzel, which is very good, and this beer. Smells like a sour. Let's see what this tastes like. Yeah, that's a nice sour. Very flavorful, nice sour. So I've got the beer, and then I wanted to talk about Bibles. So a couple of days ago, I watched a video from Mayberry Book Club. He had been reading a copy of the Bible that he has, an edition that looks fairly recent, certainly published in the 21st century. And he was surprised because he came across a typo, a full hyperlink, you know, the HTTP, a full-on hyperlink in the middle of a sentence. And he thought that was quite neat. I thought that was quite neat to see as well. And it got me thinking about typos in Bibles in general. Now, of course, I like my A. Edward Newton, and I was immediately reminded of Newton's 1925 essay collection called The Greatest Books in the World, or The Greatest Book in the World, rather, and other papers. And the title essay, The Greatest Book in the World, is of course the Bible. And in this essay, Newton talks about the history of the Bible in the English-speaking world in terms of its translation and its printing. And he brings us all the way up to what would have been his present day, so just about 100 years ago. And of course, nowadays, as in his time, the two most common ways to read the Bible is either, you know, in the original Latin, which I believe the Catholic Church still does for the most part. In the English-speaking world, the Latin Bible was, and I think is still referred to as, the Vulgate sometimes. And then, of course, you have the King James Bible, which was the, you know, authorized translation published in England in 1611. And then if you're in English-speaking North America, and at least growing up in the evangelical Protestant tradition, you probably come across the NIV, which was the New International Version, or even more recently, the New Living Translation, the NLT. And so there's several translations of the Bible out there. The Bible is, of course, considered the best-selling book of all time. I think that was, you know, established back in the 90s, which means, of course, in addition to being the best-selling book, it's a book that has been printed and published in many, many formats over the years, which of course leaves lots of room for error. And I think it's a lot easier today to correct a typo in a Bible. Certainly in the way publishing is done today. You can catch it, you know, through spell check, through editing software. But in Newton's time, and prior to that, of course, it wasn't so easy to, one, catch those typos, and two, to fix those typos when you did catch them. In my reading, I've come across a lot of detail on what people would do, what a printer would do if they found an error like this. So if they were lucky enough to catch this error early on in the printing process, then they could reprint that signature. So a signature is that large sheet of paper where multiple pages of the books are printed on it. And then of course that would be folded up, and all those signatures, all those folded up pieces of paper would be sewn together, bound together to make the book. So if the printer was lucky enough to catch it before too many of those pages were printed, they could just, discard what had been printed and reprint those signatures. However, if they got too far along in the process, or if in the case of smaller printing houses or in the early days of printing, when a printer didn't necessarily have a lot of typeface, they might be in the difficult position where the typeset had already been disassembled, had already been taken apart, because in some cases they would, set the type, you'd print all the pages from that type you would need for your print run. So, maybe you're printing 100 copies, maybe you're printing 5,000 copies. So you'd print all that, and then you would take those typeset pages apart, and you would set the type for the next set of pages in the book. And if you found that error after you had already taken the type apart, then you could either, if it was small enough, leave it as is. You could paste a bit of paper into the front or the back of the book or somewhere, saying, there is this typo here. That's not what it's meant to be. This is what it's meant to be. You could alternatively just reset and print the single paper. So instead of resetting and reprinting the entire signature, you're just going to maybe glue or paste your new page over the page that's incorrect, or you're going to cut out that incorrect page and bind in a single leaf. And in some cases, this is what's happened when you come across an older book and there's just one page in there that looks really out of place. Sometimes, it's much smaller, it doesn't seem to be connected to the other folded signatures in that book. Sometimes that's what has happened there. There's needed to be an adjustment or a change in a typo. And so instead of reprinting, 8 or 12 separate pages that needed to be folded, they just remove the error and reprint the one page either front and back, or if it's only printed on one side, just that one side. And so, yeah, it used to be much more difficult to fix typos like that. Now, of course, if it's an ebook, you can just do it. If it's, a digital file, you can do that very easily. But especially with Bibles, printers would often run into trouble when they made errors like this. And sometimes they would have to destroy the entire print run because there wasn't much else you could do. And especially if the book got out into circulation, the printers could face legal consequences from the state. They could be accused of heresy. They could have massive fines placed against them. And I think in some cases, depending on what the book was and depending on which country, which state you were living and printing in, you could even have faced arrest if you didn't act quick enough to fix these typos in a religious text. And so, of course, thinking of all this, I was reminded of some of the most famous examples. There is, of course, the Wicked Bible, sometimes referred to as the Sinner's Bible or the Adulterer's Bible. And that's because of a passage in Exodus, the 6th commandment, where thou shalt not commit adultery has a typo. The not is missing. And so the commandment read in that printing of the Bible, thou shalt commit adultery. And I'm just trying to remember exactly what the consequences were in that case. But it would have been sometime in the 1630s when the Wicked Bible was published with that error. And to make matters worse, it was the official printers of the crown. So it was an authorized printing house, printers authorized by the government to print the Bible. And it would have been, of course, a King James version of the Bible. They were authorized to print it. They made this error, and they unfortunately ended up facing a fine. They had to pay a fine, and they were told that they needed to destroy every last copy of that wicked Bible, as we now call it. And most copies were destroyed, but around 15 copies of that Bible survive. And if you're lucky enough to be one of the privileged few to make it to the many institutions where those Bibles are housed, and to have the authorization to go in and view them, you can. And they're all over, North America and Europe, mostly in university libraries and in state libraries as well. And I realize I've said the word state here a couple of times, but I'm not talking about, a state as in a province, territory, or state. I'm talking about state as in the broader meaning of the term. So, a nation state, although, not all states are nation states, so to speak. I won't get into that. But when I say state, I'm talking specifically about the institution of a country. And so they're in state libraries and university libraries and whatnot. But that's not the only major instance where there has been controversy around typos in Bibles. There's the Vinegar Bible, which is one of my favorites. It's just so funny to think of this certain parable being about vinegar instead of vineyard. And so I think it was 1717 or something like that. This Vinegar Bible was accidentally published. And basically what happened there is there's a passage in Luke where a heading, instead of reading the parable of the vineyard, read the parable of the vinegar. And I think it stood out even more because, as I recall, from my childhood days in Sunday school, the parable of the vineyard appears not only in Luke, but I think it appears in a couple of the other apostle books in the New Testament as well. And so it may make an appearance in, Matthew and Mark as well. And so there certainly would have been a discrepancy when you go to look at your Bible and you see the Vinegar Bible. And I don't think there were any legal consequences in that case, but with that one as well, very few copies survive. And then, of course, there is the Printer's Bible from 1612, which I find quite funny. And, people have raised the thought, is this really a typo, or is this the printer showing a little bit of attitude? Because there is, I think it's Psalm 119. In Psalm 119, there's a line about the princes have persecuted me. And it ends up reading something along the lines of, I have been persecuted by printers, or the printers are persecuting me. And so it's probably a typo, it's probably a mistake, but you can just imagine, the typesetter, probably some young apprentice, laying the type for this Bible, which would be a long, arduous process, and just, throwing this in as a joke, just to see it in print because their boss has been, persecuting them so much, or their boss has been really hard on them. But that's probably not what it is at all. It's probably just an honest to goodness typo. But that's the interesting thing about a lot of these old Bibles, because it was, so common for Bibles to be printed in the last couple centuries, because it was such a popular book, and because so many different editions were printed. You have, of course, all these typos naturally emerging because human error is a thing. And then in addition to that, you also have just differences in translation. You have the Breeches Bible. That's the one where I think in Genesis, Adam and Eve are described as making breeches out of leaves, which obviously doesn't make sense in the context of the original translation of the Bible, because breeches was, a very European concept, I think. And then there's just, natural things that get stuck in, natural shifts in translation that happen as the people over the centuries reading and translating the Bible interpret things from their own viewpoint and their own perspective. And so it's just a really interesting thing. And I think there are entire books out there just on translations of the Bible, the whole translation process, how things have shifted over the years, and the errors and so-called misinterpretations in some cases that have seeped into the Bible. And one of the interesting things too is that when it comes to older Bibles, in most cases, a 19th, 18th, sometimes even a 17th century Bible isn't going to be worth all that much unless there's something unique about it. So unless you have a typo like this, or you have an interesting translation, or you have, really beautiful illustrations, or the Bible is linked to some famous person in particular, it's probably not going to be worth all that much. Many of us in the English-speaking North America who came over from, England, Scotland, probably have family Bibles in our family heritage. My family has a family Bible. It arrived with some of my mother's ancestors when they came over to North America in, I think it was the 1830s or the 1850s. But it's really not worth much. Despite it, quote, being so old, and it would be worth a lot more if it had, really nice illustrations. The illustrations in it really aren't that interesting to look at. Everything's kind of discolored by this point. And it's not one of those Bibles that has interesting typos or interesting translations either. But it's always interesting to find and touch and look at an old Bible or an old book. And I think it would be even more interesting to come across, a copy of one of these famous typoed Bibles. But anyway, I've never seen one of these errors for myself, not in an old Bible, not even in a new Bible. But I think it's pretty neat just to know that this common issue in the printing of Bibles persists to this day. And thankfully, nobody's getting fined or accused of heresy for their biblical typos these days.